It is 2 a.m. on August 4th, 1987, and a 19-day-old girl is lying in a hospital crib on the pediatric ward of Harlem Hospital Center and taped to her tiny arm. Her parents, 16-year-old Joy White and 18-year-old Carl Tyson, have finally gone home to sleep after a night spent watching their daughter fight a raging fever. A woman in white has been sitting with them for weeks now, calming their nerves, telling them everything will be fine. They believe she is a nurse. She is not. By 4 a.m., the 4 is disconnected. The crib is empty, and the woman in white is gone. For 23 years, nobody will find that baby. But somewhere out there, she is going to find herself. Welcome back to vanishpointmedia, the channel that tells the stories of the missing that the world moves past too quickly. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because we cover cases like this one every week. Real cases, verified facts, no embellishment. And before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight. Now, here is the question at the center of this story. How does a newborn vanish from a hospital in the largest city in America, with no surveillance footage, no fingerprints, no leads, and stay missing for 23 years, only to be found not by police, not by the FBI, not by a tip line, but by the very woman who was taken? This is the case of Carlina White. And what makes it extraordinary isn't just that she was found, it's that she found herself. To understand how a baby could disappear from a hospital in the middle of Manhattan and stay missing for over 2 decades, you have to understand what New York City looked like in August of 1987. And just as importantly, what safeguards did not yet exist. Harlem Hospital Center on Malcolm X Boulevard was and still is one of the busiest public hospitals in the country. In 1987, it served a densely packed, working-class neighborhood, and its maternity and pediatric wards moved fast. Staff turnover was constant. Shift changes happened at odd hours, often in the dead of night, when hallways were quieter and fewer eyes were watching who came and went. The hospital did have a video surveillance system. It simply wasn't working the night Carlina disappeared. There was no functioning camera to capture the woman who had been sitting with the White family for weeks. No footage of her walking out with a 19-day-old infant in her arms. There was also no infrastructure built to catch what happened next. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had only been founded 3 years earlier, in 1984, and it was still in its infancy, both in funding and in reach. There was no searchable national database that police in one city could easily cross-reference with hospitals or clinics in another. Hospital security protocols for newborns, the electronic ankle bracelets and door alarms that are now standard in most American maternity wards, were not yet widespread. A hospital could lose a child, and there was no automatic system designed to prevent it or immediately flag it the moment it happened. DNA testing existed in a laboratory sense by 1987, but it was not yet a tool available to ordinary families. There was no consumer testing kit you could buy for under $100 and mail in from your kitchen table. And there was one more thing working against Joy White and Carl Tyson. They were 16 and 18 years old. Young, unmarried, working-class parents in Harlem in 1987 did not always receive the same urgency, the same resources, or the same media attention that a case involving an older, more affluent family might have received. The investigation moved. But it moved into a void, in a city of millions, with almost none of the tools that exist today. This is the world Carlina White vanished into. Joy White was 16 years old in the summer of 1987. Carl Tyson was 18. They were young, they were together, and on July 15th of that year, they became parents to a baby girl they named Carlina Renee White. By every account from those who knew them, they were thrilled. 19 days later, that chapter was ripped away from them. It started with something almost every new parent has lived through, a fever. Carlina had developed a high temperature, spiking to 104 degrees. Joy and Carl brought her to Harlem Hospital Center in the middle of the night. Doctors determined she had developed an infection after swallowing fluid during birth, a treatable condition, and admitted her for observation. She was placed on intravenous antibiotics. Her parents stayed by her side, exhausted, scared, but relieved that their daughter was in good hands. During that stay, a woman appeared. She wore white. She moved through the ward like she belonged there, and she was kind to Joy and Carl in the particular way that eases the nerves of frightened teenage parents. She had, according to family accounts, been seen around the hospital for roughly 3 weeks before that night, long enough to become a familiar, trusted face. Joy and Carl believed she was a nurse. No one at the hospital had told them otherwise. Exhausted from the sleepless vigil at their daughter's bedside, Joy and Carl eventually left to go home and rest, trusting that the ward and the woman in white would look after Carlina until they returned. They had no way of knowing that trust would cost them 23 years with their daughter. It happened between 2:30 and 4 o'clock in the morning. The pediatric ward at Harlem Hospital Center was quiet in those hours, the way hospitals go quiet just before dawn. Carlina White lay in her crib with an 4-line taped to her small arm, 19 days old, fighting an infection that doctors had assured her parents was treatable. Joy White and Carl Tyson were not there. The woman in white was still there. No one at Harlem Hospital Center can say with certainty what happened in the exact moment Carlina's 4 was removed. There is no footage of it. What is known as this: sometime in that window between 2:30 and 4 a.m., someone disconnected the intravenous line from Carlina's arm. Someone lifted her from her crib, and someone carried her out of the hospital, past nurses' stations, past hallways, out into the pre-dawn dark of Manhattan, without a single alarm sounding, without a single camera recording it, without a single witness stopping her. By the time a nurse checked the crib again, it was empty. She did not need to break in. She simply had to walk out, holding a baby, in a hospital where a woman holding a baby raised no alarm at all. When Joy White and Carl Tyson returned to the hospital that morning, ready to bring their daughter home, they were told their daughter was gone. What followed was chaos, and then something worse than chaos: silence. Hospital staff scrambled to search the building floor by floor. Within hours, hospital administrators notified the New York City Police Department, and detectives arrived to begin what would become one of the most difficult kinds of cases to solve: a stranger abduction from a public building with no physical evidence left behind. Investigators pulled the hospital's surveillance tapes first. There weren't any. Detectives interviewed hospital staff, trying to identify the woman in white. Descriptions were vague. She had blended in. Police did develop leads. In the years that followed, NYPD detectives questioned a woman in Baltimore whom witnesses believed matched the description of the person seen at the hospital. That interview produced nothing conclusive, and the trail went cold. Carlina's photograph, an infant picture paired with an age-progressed image showing what she might look like as she grew, was circulated by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. But those tools, in 1987, were limited. There was a flyer, a photograph, and a case file that, as months turned into years, moved further down the stack. What Joy White and Carl Tyson got instead of their daughter was the beginning of a wait that would stretch on for 23 years, with no evidence, no witness, and no way of knowing whether their daughter was even still alive. The baby taken from Harlem Hospital did not disappear into nothing. She grew up. She went to school. She had a childhood, of a kind, in Bridgeport, Connecticut, under the name Nedra Nettie, Nance, raised by a woman who told her she was her mother. That woman was Anyajetta and Petway. According to those who knew Petway, in 1987 she had told friends she was pregnant. She left Bridgeport for a period of time and returned with an infant. Friends and family assumed she had simply gone elsewhere to give birth. No one had reason to question it. That assumption held for over 2 decades. But Nedra Nance carried her own quiet suspicions. The first concrete anchor came when she was old enough to need a driver's license. Petway could not produce a birth certificate. She had attempted to forge one, but could not create anything that looked genuine enough to pass. The second anchor came years later, when Nance became pregnant herself. Prenatal care requires documentation too. Again, there was no birth certificate. Again, there was no explanation that held together. By this point, Nance had grown into an adult with a daughter of her own, carrying a nagging, unresolved doubt that had followed her since childhood. She did not look like the family she was raised in. Family members who knew both of them would later describe a relationship that was strained, at times harshly so. 23 years is a long time to live with a question you cannot answer. She just didn't yet know where to take that doubt. By 2010, Nedra Nance was 23 years old, living in Atlanta, Georgia, with a 5-year-old daughter of her own named Samani. She had, for years, quietly checked in on the website of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, scrolling through photographs of children reported missing decades earlier. In 2010, she decided to widen her search, including New York. And on the center's website, she found a photograph, an infant girl, reported missing in 1987, alongside an age-progressed image showing what that child might look like as a grown woman. Nance stared at that photograph. It looked like her own baby pictures. It looked, she would later say, like her own daughter, Samani. This is the moment the entire case turns, and it belongs entirely to her. Not to a detective working a cold case file. Not to a forensic lab running a new DNA technique. To a 23-year-old mother in Atlanta, sitting in front of a computer screen, feeling something she could not shake. In December of 2010, Nedra Nance picked up the phone and called the hotline for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. She wasn't calling with proof. She was calling with a feeling, a photograph that looked too much like her own face, and 23 years of unanswered questions. That was enough. The center connected Nance with Joy White, the woman listed as the mother of the missing infant in the 1987 case file. Neither of them had proof yet. What they had was a photograph, a feeling, and the willingness to find out. They didn't wait for lab results to meet. Before DNA testing was even complete, Joy White and Nedra Nance arranged to see each other in person in New York in January of 2011. Here is the question worth sitting with for a moment. How do you solve a cold case with no surveillance footage, no fingerprints, no forensic evidence collected at the scene, in a system that in 1987 had no searchable national database and no accessible DNA technology? The answer, in this case, is that you don't need any of that if the missing person is still alive, still capable of noticing that her own life doesn't add up, and persistent enough to keep looking until she finds the missing piece staring back at her from a website. Then the science caught up to the suspicion. DNA testing was performed to formally confirm what Joy White and Nedra Nance already felt they knew. The results came back in January of 2011. Nedra Nettie Nance was, and had always been, Carlina Renee White. And once that fact was confirmed, everything else in Carlina's life that had never quite made sense suddenly did. The missing birth certificate was no longer an unexplained inconvenience. It was the direct consequence of the fact that, Petway had never legally given birth to the child she was raising, and had no legitimate document to produce because none had ever existed. The strain in Carlina's relationship with Petway made a different kind of sense, too. This was not a woman who had adopted a child out of love and simply struggled as a parent. According to federal investigators, this was a woman who had taken the infant after her own efforts to have a child of her own had failed, and who then spent 23 years maintaining a lie complex enough to survive driver's license applications, pregnancy, and a daughter's slow, mounting suspicion. The woman in white finally had a name. Anyajetta and Petway of Bridgeport, Connecticut, later living in Raleigh, North Carolina, was identified as the woman who had spent roughly 3 weeks embedding herself into the routine of the pediatric ward at Harlem Hospital Center before walking out with a 19-day-old infant in the dead of night. She had a prior record involving larceny, theft, and forgery as a teenager, and she struggled with drug addiction as an adult. She did not fit the profile of a predator most people imagine. She fit the profile, instead, of someone quietly desperate enough to walk into a hospital and never leave with anything less than a child that wasn't hers. 23 years of silence was in fact the result of one woman's ability to hide in plain sight, and one daughter's ability to eventually notice that plain sight didn't add up. Carlina White got something almost no one in her position ever gets. Her biological family, alive, reachable, and ready to embrace her the moment they knew the truth. That reunion took place at LaGuardia Airport, and by every account from those present, it was joyous. When I saw her, my heart just dropped, Carl Tyson told reporters. That is more than most families in this kind of case will ever get. But 23 years is also not nothing, and no reunion, however warm, can hand back what was actually taken. Carlina White did not get a childhood with her biological parents. She grew into adulthood as someone else, in another woman's house, under another woman's rules, carrying a low, persistent doubt she could never fully resolve until she was 23 years old and a mother herself. That is not a wound reunion erases. It's a wound reunion finally makes visible. There was also no clean, satisfying justice waiting at the end of this story. And Petway surrendered to authorities in North Carolina on a probation violation days after the reunion made headlines. And in February 2012, she pled guilty in Manhattan federal court to 1 count of kidnapping. There was no trial, no jury, no extended public reckoning. Just a guilty plea, and a case finally closed on paper 24 years after it began. What Carlina White gained was real: a mother, a father, an extended family, and an answer to the question that had followed her since childhood. What she lost was also real and permanent: 23 years that can never be lived again under any name. Carlina, for 23 years, the world called you Nedra. Your family called you Nettie. But your name, from the very first day of your life, was Carlina Renee White. Your mother never stopped hoping you'd come home. Your father never stopped believing he'd see your face again. And in the end, it wasn't a detective or a database or a stroke of luck that brought you back to them. It was you, a young mother in Atlanta, staring at a photograph, refusing to accept a story about her own life that didn't add up. You solved your own kidnapping. Not many people in this world can say that. If this story moved you, that's the point of telling it. These aren't just headlines from decades ago. They're real families, real years lost, and in this case, a real ending that most families in this position never get to have. So here's what I want to know. If you were Carlina, staring at that photo on a missing children's website, would you have trusted your gut the way she did? Or would you have talked yourself out of it, the way so many of us do when the truth feels too big to believe? Tell me in the comments below. If you want more stories like this one, true, verified, and told with the respect these families deserve, hit subscribe, ring the notification bell, and I'll see you in the next one.